Hey, Thea, this is Tom. Should we start? Or are you going to say anything?
Yeah, go ahead and start whenever you guys are ready.
Okay, thanks, Thea.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. We've got a nice crowd here in person at Baruch, and welcome to everybody that's online. I'm Tom O'Halloran. I'm faculty in forestry and environmental conservation, and I work down here at the Baruch Institute. And we're very glad to welcome today Camilo Rey-Sanchez from NC State for our seminar today. Camilo is faculty in marine earth and atmospheric science at NC State. And he got his PhD at Ohio State University in environmental science and did a postdoc at UC Berkeley, also, I think, environmental science, and is interested in land atmosphere interactions and wetlands and forests and things that are of interest to us. So thank you very much, Camilo, for coming, and welcome, and enjoy the show.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks for attending this seminar. Today, I'm going to show you some of our recent research in studying forests in North Carolina. I think it's great to be here in South Carolina, connecting forest research across the two states. So for today, I'm mostly going to focus on my research studying fluxes of carbon dioxide and methane from forests. Like, this is one of our towers that we just installed, a 100-feet tall tower that collects methane and carbon dioxide flux continuously. So we'll talk more about this. I do want to acknowledge, first of all, my student, PhD student Darian is here, and he will be part of the presentation at the end, showing some of his dissertation research. And also my other student, Sebastian Diaz-Cortez, who is not here, but he did contribute a lot to the presentation. And my co-authors in the Department of Forestry at NC State, Marcelo Ardon, Maricar Aguilos, and John King. So here's the outline of today's presentation. I'm going to give you some background on methane fluxes. Then we're going to talk about the importance of bottomland hardwood forest. And then I will introduce our study sites and looking at their greenhouse gas budgets based on the measurements we have taken so far. And then we're going to focus on methane fluxes from trees, the importance of trees as conduits of methane to the atmosphere. But also Darian will speak more about the spatial heterogeneity of methane fluxes using the flux footprint analysis, and what are some of the environmental drivers of methane flux in different wind sectors around the flux towers. And we're going to end with some conclusions. Okay, what's the importance of this? We know that atmospheric methane concentration is rising. In fact, in the previous decade, its concentration started to increase more steadily. And we know it's the same for carbon dioxide. Concentration, last time I checked, was about 422 parts per million. Now we have methane that is above 1900 parts per billion and continues to increase, right? So this is warming the planet. And we know a lot of this has been due to anthropogenic activity, fossil fuel extraction, land use change. But we also know that a lot of it is just natural processes. And we know that, in particularly, wetlands produce a lot of methane. So here's more or less the distribution of different sources of methane to the atmosphere. We know there's a lot from fossil fuel production and use, a lot from agriculture, basically cattle raising, but also rice farming. But when you look at wetlands, you have a large contribution, 167, these are units of tons of methane per year, or teragrams of methane per year. This is an average from 2003 to 2012, so it's rather not updated. I think there's a recent one, a more recent one that was just released. So important here that to know that at the same time, there's natural sinks of methane, chemical reactions in the atmosphere with hydroxyl radical that transform that methane into carbon dioxide. Same with processes at the soils and at the surface that take that methane from the atmosphere and transform it into CO2. So we call that methane oxidation, which will be relevant also for this talk. So another important feature of this plot here is the uncertainty on the methane flux, right? These numbers in parentheses are the bounds. We really don't know to a great degree how much methane these wetlands are emitting. And so that's where our research comes from. We need to know, we need to better constrain those fluxes. And part of the reason why this methane emissions are so complex to study is because there is a diversity of production and transport mechanisms. The general idea is that you have wetland plants that grow in inundated conditions. And these wetland plants are great to store carbon in the soil because once they die, they go to the carbon pool. And because the inundated conditions create anoxic soils, then you reduce the respiration. So there's less CO2 going to the atmosphere. However, those same conditions that restrict the CO2 release to the atmosphere also are producing methane. So methanogens thrive in those anaerobic or anoxic conditions, and they produce methane that is stored in the sediments of wetlands. That methane can then be transported to the atmosphere via diffusion through saturated soils, or it can also be diffused to the water and from the water to the soil, or it can also be transported via ebullition. So bubbles that form at the pore waters and then they are just released once they hit a critical pressure. Importantly for this talk is the transport that plants can also, the role that plants can also play in transporting some of the methane produced in the soils and transporting it towards the atmosphere. Particularly wetland plants, they have these tissues called parenchyma that they use to transport oxygen from the atmosphere to the roots so that the roots can be alive. And then, but that same conduit becomes a conduit for methane. So methane is readily transported by some of these plants. Some of these trees can also transport some of the methane, and we're going to see some research in that regard. So we call that parenchyma transport. And very importantly, we have oxidation of methane that is done usually in aerobic conditions by organisms called methanotrophs. So these methanotrophs are bacteria that take the methane in the presence of oxygen and transform it into CO2. So oxidation is a very important process because it is considered that between 30 to 40% of all the methane that is produced in wetlands is oxidized. So more oxidation, the better for the planet in terms of greenhouse gases. So as you can see, it's a complex process, and our lab uses different techniques to study these fluxes. So we're interested in looking at leaf level fluxes using leaf level gas exchange analyzers, but we also look at stem fluxes using stem chambers. We sometimes take leaves to the lab and analyze those fluxes from individual leaves, more at the ecophysiological level. Or we also use toll chambers like these ones to look at how much methane is being transported. So these are great tools, these chambers. However, the issue is that they only give you a snapshot in time of the methane flux. So we are now more focused on studying fluxes using the eddy covariance technique, which gives you continuous measurements of that methane flux you have a permanent measurement of wind in 3 dimensions at high frequency, and you measure methane here with this big gas analyzer and CO2 with this smaller one. You can calculate the flux as the covariance of the wind, vertical wind speed, and the changes in concentration of a scalar of interest, right? This could be methane, CO2, nitrous oxide, water vapor. So this is great, and you've probably seen these towers before. Tom here has 6 towers here studying fluxes in South Carolina. So today I'm going to show you some of our research using these towers. It's important to learn that these fluxes that we measure come from an area that we call footprint, which is kind of the field of view of the flux measurement. And basically, as the gases, in this case, methane, is released, these parcels of air are carried by eddies. And we know that what we measure at the tower is just we can represent the source of this measurement by a statistical model that allows us to create this area where the measurements most likely came from. That's what we call the footprint. So we like footprints a lot, and we're developing a lot of our research on footprints. It's important to know that footprints vary with wind direction, right? If we have a wetland here, this is in California, and this is a tower, and this is the 50% footprint and the 80% footprint, which means we know that 80% of the sources that we measure here come from this area. So we know that it changes with wind direction, but it also changes with tower height. So higher towers create larger footprints. The roughness of the surface, how rough are the elements, turbulence, atmospheric stability. So this is basically an atmospheric model that creates these footprints. Now, what our lab did, building on the footprint concept, was this idea of footprint wave flux maps, where we're trying to better understand the spatial heterogeneity of fluxes around a flux tower. So what we do is a basic superposition of different footprints, and we are assigning the value of the methane flux to those cells within the 80% footprint. Oh, there's this. Well, there was a little animation. Let me see if I can get it. Yeah. So we superimpose these footprints with different flux magnitudes. Eventually, the idea would be that we will reveal patterns, or where the fluxes are higher and where the fluxes are lower. So for example, here we could identify this as a little hotspot of methane flux. So this is kind of the general idea. We tested this in a site in a wetland in California, where we had here in the lower side restored wetland, and on the upper side we had an alfalfa field. So by just looking at the tower data without putting any information on what the land cover site is, we're creating these maps that are representing what the fluxes are. So we know now that methane fluxes are much higher from the wetland. Of course, we have inundated conditions, and really low from the alfalfa fields because those fields are dry. The CO2 looks like more photosynthesis is happening in the alfalfa fields and not so much in the wetlands. And in terms of water vapor, we know that those alfalfa fields are transpiring a lot, so higher transpiration, and not so much in the wetlands in this particular time of the year because they were more dry. So interestingly is that if we look at the nighttime here, what we can further do with these maps is not just create a representation of how the methane is changing with wind direction, but we could also detect some patterns along the main wind. So in this case, for example, at nighttime, we have these longer footprints where we're reaching these fallow fields, and we're almost detecting like a change in the fluxes that would be expected because we have a very inundated area in a dry area. So these are patterns that are not 100% accurate, but it gives you an idea for you to better analyze your data. So now we're doing a transition to how this is applied to our sites. We know that wetlands are especially heterogeneous in their land cover composition, but also in the way they produce methane, right? Because we have all these processes happening at the same time. So we now wanted to study this in the bottomland hardwood forest, which think of it as just like a swamp, like this photo here, which are common in North Carolina and here in South Carolina, occurring in wet environments. The common feature is that you have the water level very close to the surface, sometimes above the surface, sometimes below, but they're inundated from time to time. And the tree species are adapted to this, right? So you have species like the bold cypress that have these bold cypress knees that I'm not sure they have settled on whether they are there to aerate the roots or not, but I think that's what the main idea is. But they're adapted to this water levels that create low oxygen levels. And yeah, in North Carolina, most of these swamp forests were cut, and now these forests have regrown. Some of them are mostly privately owned. I think very similar situation to what we have in South Carolina. And so one of the questions we're interested in is what would happen to these forests with increased salinization and sea level rise? This is one of the background large-scale motivations for our work. We know that if sea level continues to rise, this swamp forest will transition into ghost forests. And if that happens, maybe carbon dioxide sequestration can diminish. So, you know, there's still a lot to learn about that, but this is a general idea that this is what would happen. But less clear is what would happen to methane emissions, right? One hypothesis that we are trying to think about is if we have a forest that is in dry conditions and not a lot of methane is produced, then you have low methane emissions. But as the sea level rises, you may create more anoxic conditions where methane may increase. But maybe there's a point where the inundation levels become so high that the trees die, you have snags, and that maybe lowers the methane emissions. Okay, so this is just one of our hypotheses. We haven't really tested this, but we're trying to better understand this. And one way is by studying these tree level methane fluxes, right? So our trees actually contributing a lot to how much methane is released to the atmosphere. So this is what we did in our study sites. So we currently have 2 towers by the Alligator River in the North Carolina coast. One is the Timberlake Forest here on the left, which is a restored wetland that was previously on agricultural land that was ditched, water levels were controlled, and the site was restored back in 2007. So the ecosystem is still growing steadily. The other side is the Alligator River, which is on the Alligator River Nature Preserve, which is this large area here. This scale here is 10 kilometers. So this is a large area, but it's very different from Timber Lake in that the soils are more peaty, so more organic carbon, and the water levels are higher, right? So you do tend to see higher water levels. And this is the flux tower in Alligator that is maintained by our collaborators in the forestry department, John King and Maricar Aguilos. So we're gonna start with looking at Alligator River, and we wanted to study this because we know there's a lot of methane being produced there. So that's a great scenario for us to study how methane is transported by trees. So this is the work of my student, Sebastian, who is analyzing a lot of the data that has been already collected by our colleagues from forestry. He has done a great job. He's really good at understanding forest patterns and structure. So the first thing he did was to look at the forest composition and creating these vertical profiles of the forest species there. From those permanent plots, we know that the most abundant species is the black gum, followed by the swamp bay, then the red maple, and then the bald cypress. So together they comprise about 80% of all the biomass. So we're focusing mostly on these four species. And yeah, in this vertical profile, you can see that the tallest trees, which are the black gums, can go up to 32 meters. But really most of the biomass is in this category between 12.5 and 19 meters, where you can see here some bold cypresses and the maples. So this is really cool, but what is even cooler is that we have 10 plus years of data on diameters and biomass. And we have been able to see from this that loss of biomass that we believe is maybe due to salinity. We are not 100% sure. Maybe it's just water level increasing that is causing this loss of biomass. But we see in the above ground biomass in the past, from 2009 to 2019, we see that decline in black gum, Nyssa sylvatica. We see also declines in maple. And really the only species that has increased their biomass is Ilex opaca. So most of the trees are losing biomass. Yeah, he has a nice analysis. Sebastian has a nice analysis of different diametric classes, how they're losing biomass, but I don't have that data here. But in general, they're losing biomass. And we also know from the tower data that there's very high respiration, high CO2 fluxes in the Alligator River site. So this is from the flux tower that John King and Maricar maintain. There's some gaps here due to power issues. We have solar panels, and sometimes the solar panels are not working at their best capacity. So that's why you see some gaps here. But overall, you see that when you have these positive fluxes, that means that the ecosystem is losing carbon to the atmosphere. And when you have these negative fluxes, you know that the ecosystem is pulling carbon from the atmosphere into the biomass. And that's why you see this annual cycle where more carbon is pulled down in the growing season. And then in the dormant season, there's less of a variation. So at the same time, by measuring methane fluxes, we know that there are very high methane fluxes here, going up to 2,000 nanomoles per meter squared per second, and also very high oxidation levels that we're looking into, trying to really understand why these oxidation levels look so high. Like it indicates that the system may be taking a lot of methane as well. So we're starting to look more into that, but we don't have an answer yet. Interesting as well is it's this higher methane emissions in the fall that you see on multiple years, where you would expect methane emissions to peak maybe more towards July and August, because that's when the temperature is highest and methane responds to temperature. But we're tending to see more methane fluxes towards October, late September. So that's interesting. We're also trying to understand why that is happening. But another interesting thing about the Alligator River is that if you look at the plot on the left, once you gap fill all those gaps in the time series, and we use that, we gap fill this with artificial neural networks that incorporate the different environmental drivers of methane flux, we can create this gap fill time series of both CO2 and methane. Of course, methane looks very gappy, and so there's a high uncertainty on these gap fills. But we can start looking at what's the greenhouse gas budget of a place like Alligator. We know that due to increased mortality in 2017, there has been a lot of CO2 losses. But in the past 4 years, we tend to see slightly high carbon sink, so the ecosystem seems to be recovering. But in terms of methane flux, we do tend to see very high methane fluxes every year, which, when you include the sustained global warming potential of methane in the greenhouse gas budget, we use a number of 45 to calculate that CO2 equivalent. We can estimate the global warming potential of this site, and we can see that you do get this site becoming, unfortunately, a strong let's say, global warming source, or a source of positive radiative forcing, right? So you see that whenever the methane emissions are low, that global warming potential is much lower. So methane is the key, right? Because it has that much higher global warming potential. Okay, so now moving to whether trees are transporting some of the methane. We are currently starting a sampling campaign where we're sampling those 4 species that I told you about at 3 different heights: at the bottom, at the diameter at breast height, and at the top, along with chamber measurements to understand how much are trees actually transporting methane. And what we see is that this is data from just 1 month where we did this campaign, but we're starting to see some interesting patterns where, for example, the black gum, the most abundant species, we see much higher fluxes coming out of the tree stems at the bottom than from the soil itself. So you can think about this in a way as like trees are just pumping out methane out of soils. And maybe if you transfer this mesh flux in unit area to the whole area of the tree, maybe this can be significant. CO2 has an interesting behavior too, because it does seem like CO2 tends to decrease with height. And therefore, what we hypothesize is that those trees, there is diffusion of gases from the soil to the tree, both CO2 and methane, that may be happening. And as you can see at the top, you get very low methane. That's the same for the swamp bay. And we also have bald cypress having a similar behavior. and the red maple. The red maple is the exception in that it doesn't seem to be transporting a lot of methane. So the fluxes in the soil are much higher for the maple. So that's very interesting. I'm running a little low in time. So I'm going to pass it to Darian now. Talk about Timber Lake.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much again for having us up here. My name is Darian. I'm a PhD student in Camilo's lab, and I'll be here to talk about our second research site, Timber Lake Forest. And I'll be coming at this from the perspective of spatial heterogeneity in the land surface conditions and in the spatial patterns of methane emissions. So let's look at some satellite images of our site here, Timber Lake. That red marker there is where our flux tower is located at. This is just a true color image of the site. We can also bring in vegetation index to look at the greenness of the surface, how much vegetation there is throughout the site. So this would indicate the presence of trees and vegetation, and a water index to show how much water there is at the surface. So this site is characterized by different forest management practices that have gone on historically. So that road that runs mostly east to west, where that flux tower is located at, to the south of that, that land was ditched and drained, and they had replanted some trees there. And there have since been some recolonization of pine trees there. And then to the north, they had ditched that area, but not drained it, nor have they planted any trees. So you can see in the vegetation index, much fewer trees there, a lot of mortality in the vegetation up there, and a lot wetter at the site to the north. And then to the east, that's just totally natural. Not ditched, not drained, not replanted. So this is the heterogeneity of the land surface conditions throughout Timber Lake's site. To diagnose the spatial patterns of methane emissions, we use those flux maps that Camilo introduced very, very well, but I'll do a quick refresher of how they're calculated and then how they're applied here. So this is some data from Flux Tower. And you would take those meteorological variables, wind speed, turbulence, friction, and in this context, more importantly, wind direction, to calculate footprints. So you take a period of time, and every half hour, you're calculating the different source areas, so the areas around the flux tower that you're getting your measurements from. And at different times, you're gonna get measurements from various areas, so either the northwest or sometimes to the east. And when you integrate methane, or really any flux data, but for this case, methane, you get these flux maps that give you a spatial dimension to how methane is being produced and emitted around your flux tower. So we can take this map and we can superimpose that onto our satellite images like this. That's pretty cool. So you can see the spatial patterns that we see in the land surface very highly relate to the patterns that we're seeing in methane as well. So these that wet area to the north, we see much higher methane emissions from that side of the site. And then to the east and to the south, you have very low emissions, sometimes even negative. So when it's negative, that's the downward movement of methane, the removal of methane from the atmosphere. And that's oxidation, which I'll get to in a little bit as well. And you also get some spatial, this is all spatial. You get some temporal information from these flux maps as well. You can see how these patterns might change over time. So these maps are made from data in the beginning of the growing season in May. And a more recent flux map from September, you can see how this has kind of evolved a little bit over time. You still get these high fluxes from the north, from that wet, inundated, flooded area. But then to the east now, you have this moment of methane popping up. But you still have those negative or the very low fluxes to the northwest, to the south, or northeast and the south. And using these flux maps and knowing what these patterns look like, we can partition out our methane data by the different sectors that we're seeing here and kind of see how the different areas might relate to the different environmental drivers of methane and kind of compare them against each other and across time. So this is what that would look like. So this is methane and seeing how it's related to the different environmental drivers such as carbon dioxide fluxes, temperature fluxes, solar radiation coming in. So you would have different relationships, degrees of slopes here from the north, from the east, from the southwest here. So this is a lot of information that I'm just throwing at you here. I'm just gonna focus on one aspect of this. And it's the fact that most of the relationships with temperature we're seeing here are negative relationships here. So this is kind of weird. As Camilo said, methane is created from microbes in the soil, and temperature drives more microbial activity. And you would normally expect when temperatures increase, there'd be more methanogens making methane, and you would have more methane emissions. But what this is showing here is that as temperatures have been increasing, we've been seeing lower methane emissions. So that's kind of counter to what we expected. And
Is that the third column, TS?
the third column, that's soil temperature. So yeah, these are different areas of temperature. So there's air temperature, soil temperature, ground heat flux, sensible heat. I'm sorry, I should have introduced that a little bit better. Yes. Yeah. So what we're thinking is happening here is the significance, the impact of methane oxidation at this site. And I'm going to show some brief, very early research into this right now just to investigate this. So we've identified 4 different areas informed by those flux maps in the different areas. And we've been taking gas samples from the soils here and running them through an isotopic analyzer to see the ratio of carbon-12 in this methane and carbon-13 in this methane. So those bacteria, those microbes that are consuming methane, they will prefer carbon-12. So you'll see in the sample, the ratio will swing towards a larger proportion of it being carbon-13 if there is a lot of oxidation happening and a lot of that removal of methane. So here's a very simplified look at what that looks like. That second column there, K, that's just the reaction rates, showing how fast the methane is being either produced or consumed. And the main thing to just know about this is that a positive reaction means that there's more oxidation happening than production. And that's what we're seeing here with site 2 quite consistently. So we've taken 4 measurements over time here. These are just the median values. So this area here has been oxidizing more than, or more oxidation has been happening than production there. Site 1 down here, 1 of the 4 times had more oxidation. So this kind of points to the heterogeneity in both the methane production and the methane consumption, which is quite an interesting characteristic of this site here. So we can zoom back out. We can look back at the annual tendencies of methane fluxes here, the bottom graph here. And you see that a lot of these values are in the negative. You can contrast that to what we saw with Alligator River, where a lot of them were mostly in the positive. So this is showing that throughout the year, there's a lot of methane removal or oxidation going on even when it's really high methane production season. Yeah, so that's the methane in Timberlake. We can also look at CO2. So Timberlake is still a pretty healthy forest despite that flooded area to the north. So carbon dioxide is still being removed quite efficiently from here. There's a lot of carbon being removed here. And you can see the grams of carbon being removed from the atmosphere, both in the carbon fluxes and in the carbon dioxide fluxes and methane fluxes. And when you pair these two together, when we're looking at the global warming potential, we're seeing a negative forcing here. So this site in a long time scale is cooling the climate, comparing that to Alligator River where we had these positive forcings. So Alligator River with those higher methane emissions is contributing more greenhouse gases and more warming compared to what Timberlake is doing. So it's pretty interesting to think about where Timberlake lies in an ecosystem transition perspective. Most of it is dry, healthy forest, but then you have that wet area to the north, and as sea levels rise, that is going to start creeping down. And what we see up north with those high methane emissions and lower oxidation might start to encroach and become more of what the ecosystem sees in that forest. And Alligator River might be like a future look at what Timberlake may become as more flooding happens and the vegetation shifts over time. Yeah, so that's all I have for you. I'm gonna hand it back off to Camilo to.
All right, so I'm just gonna wrap it up all with some conclusions. So first of all, talking about the Alligator River site, we know that there's mortality and that has been observed by a loss of biomass, but the forest is still a CO2 sink. However, due to the high methane emissions in Alligator River, the site has a positive radiative forcing, so it's a source of warming at the moment. We also know that at Alligator, the methane fluxes from trees are high, and most of the time higher than the soil fluxes themselves, and that they tend to decrease with height. So a complete budget of the contribution of methane fluxes from trees would include that almost exponential decline of methane fluxes with tree height. On the other hand, Timberlake is a strong sink of both CO2 and methane. However, there are important spatial variations to be considered, and that Darian talked about. We do see some negative correlations between methane flux and temperature, and also photosynthetically active radiation, which can indicate potentially high methanotrophy at Timberlake, and that perhaps some of this methanotrophy is also driven by photosynthetic activity, but that's very just preliminary, kind of looking into future research. That is all we have for now, so thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions now.
I have a question.
Yes.
So more broadly on the whole methane flux. So you mentioned at the beginning that when methane is emitted into the atmosphere, a lot of it is digested or reacted by, I forget, hydroxyl or some sort of hydrogen radicals.
Right.
So when you compute your local forcing, or do you also consider how much radicals would be in the atmosphere above that area that would digest whatever methane was being produced before you come up with the balance, or is that another step later?
Right. Yeah, at the moment, the methods take kind of like a constant oxidation rate, and this constant is expressed as a half-life of methane in the atmosphere that is about 12 years. And so you put that into a model and look at how the methane will decay over 100 years horizon. And then that's how you calculate that sustained global warming potential of 45. If you were to calculate it over a 20-year horizon, it wouldn't be 45, but close to 100. But you're right that I hadn't really thought about that if somehow the hydroxyl radicals change significantly and that produces more oxidation and that would lower the half-life of methane, then the number would need to change. But I don't know how dynamic that would be there. Yeah.
So, and then as a follow-on, even though that first figure was old, right? It was 12 years old or something now, which means it's 14 years old. What we're seeing is the surplus of methane is because we have all this human activity, right? Compared to natural fluxes. And so if there was less methane in the atmosphere, less methane being produced, then there would be more hydroxyl radicals available because pre-industrial there wasn't enough methane to interact with all that hydroxyl, right? What would they be working on? I mean, would they just be sitting there as hydroxyl radicals and doing nothing chemically, or is there like some sort of a reaction chain where if there's not methane, then they go and they work on CO2 or nitrous oxide or something else instead?
Right. Yeah, I wish my colleagues from my atmospheric science department were here to answer that. Yeah, I know, maybe some reactions with ozone and, even particulate matter. But it's complex. Like this, this atmospheric chemistry I think can be very variable and really affect how that methane sink in the atmosphere changes. I think it would require a person very good on understanding atmospheric chemistry. Yeah.
I can say a teeny bit about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
The hydroxyl radical is known as the detergent of the atmosphere.
Right.
So it's extremely reactive. It's like pretty much the most reactive. So it's just going to go on, as you said, it's just going to go on
To the next thing.
It's very reactive with
In
hydrocarbon.
Okay.
in the soil, there is methane is the least likely thing to be reactive.
Right.
It starts with oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, or iron, manganese, sulfur, before you get to carbon.
But that's why I was wondering, because I knew that from Stephanie's work, but I didn't know
If that works in the
within
atmosphere the same or not.
Yeah.
Yes. Another question?
So one of the big, especially for wetlands, one of the big ecosystem services people think about is the carbon sequestration, the blue carbon, but it seems that even with these more forest and wetlands, that the sheer quantity of the methane flux seems to call it into question. So in terms of trying to decrease the total amount of global greenhouse gas warming potentially, what do you see as the way forward if these forests are also part of the problem? I mean, down forest like
Yeah, that's a great question. I should have touched on that a little more, in that we know that. Right. Yeah, the question is about the ecosystem services that wetlands provide and how it seems like, based on my research, wetlands have a negative effect on the atmosphere and the warming of the planet. So how do we basically kind of think about that going forward? And I think that the first thing is to remember that it's not all about greenhouse gases, right? So we have several priorities as as communities and different people living near these places rely on these systems. One of the key ones here is flood control, right? Another one important here is habitats for fauna, but also flora. So all those things are important so that we need to think about those things. But what we were trying to also show in this talk was that if you look at an example like Timberlake, where we had a restored wetland that over the past 10, 15 years has been a carbon sink, and now it's not a very strong methane emitter. So this is an example of a case where it's positive. Like, we know that we can restore wetlands and still provide some of these benefits that they're built for. Like, you don't really build a wetland thinking about greenhouse gases. You just build it to create habitat for ducks, or because you have to compensate from the loss of other wetlands, so you build a new one. But if in the future, we narrow down this research enough, we could provide some recommendations as to, like, maybe we do this restoration in this way to minimize that methane. And what's important about methane is that it has a very strong effect in the short term. So if we can try to reduce the amount of methane that goes to the atmosphere in the next 20, 30 years, that would have a very strong impact on the atmosphere and the planet. Yeah, great question. Yes, Tom.
Has enough work been done on the tree stem fluxes, that we're starting to get an understanding of how different species or wood density or wood type, bark type even, what is controlling this variability? I think your red maple stood out as an outlier, whereas all the sort of more wetland species look more conductive, and they don't have a parenchyma the same way.
Yeah.
Whatever other species have. So anyway, is there anything emerging about the actual wood quality itself?
I think, it's still a fairly new topic. The one thing that seems to be consistent across studies is that sort of exponential decay of methane with height. And so we're observing that as well. I don't think it's very clear how is it that methane is transported through the trees. We thought it was through the xylem, but then we talked to a wood or a plant physiologist, and this person believes that there's no way dissolved gases can go through the xylem because it could cause embolism. At the moment, what I think is happening is just that whatever porous spaces that are not xylem are moving the methane upwards. But in terms of the research, there's a lot of research also about production of methane inside the wood. That's also something that happens because you have anaerobic environments inside the wood, and maybe some wood that is decaying. So that may also contribute to the methane flux. But in the case of alligator, I think it's just clear to me that the methane and the CO2 are being transported from the soil through the tree to the atmosphere. And again, well, this is very preliminary, but we hope to continue doing this to try to be more conclusive.
Have you tried taking the bark off? Do you bark on and bark off?
No, that's something that.
Well, in the name of science.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we're lucky here. We don't.
I just pull them over. I don't girdle them first.
I do have a question about
Yes.
the species you were listing.
Yeah.
A number of them are noted for their ability to transport oxygen down into the roots. The black gum and the cypress for sure, which fellow that was director here several decades ago actually worked on that. And essentially that those trees were transporting oxygen into their rhizosphere. They appear to be the same ones, so may there be some, whatever is, like you say, whatever is putting oxygen down is an opportunity for methane to come up.
Right.
I guess that's a physiology stuff.
That's a great observation because, yeah, I really didn't know that about these two species, but it does make sense with the methane fluxes we're seeing from black gum being so high, and also taxodium.
Which are black gum and the bald cypress would be the most. William's not here, I guess, to tell us, but the black gum and the cypress would be the most likely to be growing in very deeply saturated soils. And I'm pretty sure that both of those are noted for their ability to bring oxygen into the rhizosphere. The interesting lava pine does it also, but it tends to grow at much higher ground, so that occurs much deeper in the soil.
Relatively much higher ground.
Yeah, relatively. Those extra 6 inches still.
That is.
If you look at your flux maps,
yeah.
You've got a little hotspot. Is there a farm or a gas station or something there?
Oh, this one?
No. On yours. On Navigator.
Well, maybe this? No.
Yeah, that one. So on the lower one, you have that little square on the far right, and kind of in the middle there. So look at your nighttime there.
Here?
Is there a? I mean, I don't know. Is that if there's an actual? Like I was imagining, there's a cow barn or something there, and that's why you're getting CO2 and methane at night. But I don't know if that's really that sensitive or if it's just an artifact of your data.
Yeah, I would think it's yeah, more of an artifact of the way the maps are built. So basically that little spot there, oops, I don't think we know, like, we don't have footprints coming from that area. It's just that, well, actually, yeah, I'll have to double check, because if it's a short footprint, it'll be a very short one that just had that little spot there, and it happens to be a big source of methane. But yeah, I hadn't really paid much attention to that spot. Sometimes the maps have these artifacts just because it happens that the superposition of footprints just created a little gap with maybe just one footprint there, right? But I think there's a question in Zoom. Let me see the chat. Oh, it's you? Okay.
I have one question.
Yeah.
I think it was in the alligator site. You showed a figure where the results that you expected were seen in June and July, but then in October it was higher. The results were higher than expected. And I was just wondering if you thought that was like had something it had to do with maybe the changes in the vegetation, or it was more like climatic conditions. Maybe there's more storms that were changing the soil moisture, water potential in the vegetation.
Hadn't thought about that, Darian, because we were wondering, what is it? We're thinking water level first, because we are sort of observing that the water level tends to be higher towards the fall, but you're right that it's sort of coinciding with the timing of leaf senescence. So if that's the case, that would mean that we have potentially either if we continue rolling with our hypothesis that these plants are actively oxidizing methane, at the same time they photosynthesize, it may be that once the leaves senesce, we lose that oxidation activity, and then more methane would come out. So that's a very, interesting.
Again, it could be like a physiological question of as things are, as vegetation is translocating back down, that there is some change in the gas exchange, allowing more methane to come out. I don't know. I don't know enough about what's going on in that stems, but.
Right. Yeah, because what was interesting to us is that we found this in Alligator, but Timberlake is also the same. And we tried very hard to get the most recent data. So we got data up to October 1st, basically. And we're starting to see these higher methane fluxes, but we don't have the full picture yet on Timberlake. But it'll be really cool to see if the methane continues to grow, because right now Timberlake still maintains a good amount of leaves, so they have not senesced yet. So
The vegetation at Timberlake was the same species, or?
No, it's right. It's more of, you have more of lolly pines there. We had a site that seemed to be colonized by lolly pine, and they're thriving on the southern region. And then we have some maples there, so it's a little higher up. But we also have the swamp bays there. There's a lot of overlap, but the key difference is we don't have as much bold cypress. We tend to have more of the drier, maple, and a lot of lolly pine.
That was natural. It wasn't part of the plantation.
Right. So it was. If you look at this map here, the part north of the tower, it tends to be forest with more of the species adapted to inundated conditions, like the swamp bay, and there's some black gum too, but a lot of maple as well. And then south of the tower, there was just a big patch of loblolly pine that seemed to have naturally colonized the place.
Part of the area that they planted with cypress?
Right. Yes, I think the original plan was to plant a lot of cypresses there, and you see them.
William Connor was working with people from North Carolina for a restoration of Alligator River. I don't know where it was, but I remember saying that they planted hundreds of thousands of bald cypress.
Yeah.
I don't know if this might be one of those areas. That would be interesting.
You see them as you go out close to the road here, but you see like this darker area. That's a lot of loblolly pine that has colonized. So it seems we're still trying to think what happened exactly, but we think that they tried to plant the bold cypress, but this area was just drier. Seems to be at a higher elevation, and then
would just outcompete.
Yeah, I think that was what happened. But now,
Okay, well, we've reached our time, so if we could thank Darian and Camilo again. Thank you. Thanks for joining online. So we're gonna have lunch here pretty soon. 5 minutes. hang out for lunch?
No, like